contributed to public engagement work for the Kennington Chartist project in 2018 and conducted audience analysis research for the East End Women's Museum in 2020. She's taught in English, liberal arts and history at the universities of York, Durham, Warwick and now Leeds. And today Victoria is going to talk about Chartist intelligence, Chartist activity in the Northern Star.
This is online.
So the floor is yours.
So today I'm moving us into the 1830s to talk about the Chartist movement and the Northern Star. I'm hoping that I'm not going to overlap with Mike Sanders too much, but to begin with, I'm going to just briefly outline the Chartist movement. So this was a leading sort of radical movement from the 1830s to the 1850s. It was a largely working class movement, and it was one of the first sort of mass national protest movements in Britain. The name of the movement comes from this document, the People's Charter, first authored by the London Working Men's Association in 1837. And they called for 6 points of this particular charter. They wanted universal suffrage, although what they meant was manhood suffrage. They wanted no property qualification to stand as MP or to impede voting. They wanted annual parliaments. They wanted the electoral districts to be even and equal. They wanted MPs to be paid so that working men could afford to stand to serve their country as MPs and politicians, whereas you previously had to have independent wealth to enable you to do that. For example, if you're a handloom weaver, you couldn't very much just leave your job for 9 months of the year to go and stand in Parliament in London, the most expensive city in the country. And they also wanted a vote by secret ballot as opposed to a show of hands or signing a book at a public hustings, which, as we've seen, could get quite violent. And so the Chartist movement was an explicitly kind of very literary and literate movement. So scholars like Ian Hayward and indeed Mike Sanders have talked about the literary culture of the Chartist movement. And I think it's really important that we kind of see this in terms of the radical press. The radical press is important because it's not simply a book that is being published at one time and then there for all of posterity. It means the periodicity of the press means that you're getting new information on a regular basis. And this was actually being kind of penalised by the Six Acts post Peterloo and even before Peterloo. All newspapers had to pay a tax, which in 1836 was lowered from 4 pence per copy per issue to 1 penny per copy per issue, which meant that if you were publishing more recently than every 26 days, you had to pay a tax on sharing that information. That meant that information had a real fiscal value as well as a political value, because you can only do what you can if that information, that organisation is new. So the Northern Star was really important as part of this because, one, it was a legal paper. It was a stamped paper set up by people who had been imprisoned for selling illegal newspapers before. Joshua Hobson had served 2 prison sentences in Wakefield House of Correction for publishing an illegal unstamped newspaper in his native Huddersfield down the road from Leeds, where the Northern Star was based. And this is a really interesting location to establish the paper. It was in the real heartlands of industrial Yorkshire. So we're thinking just north of Lancashire, but still very sort of a really great communication and trade route. You had the canals and the start of the railways in Leeds, but it was also completely equidistant between the literary and publishing capitals of Edinburgh in Scotland and London in England. So it was very well situated, and it was a sort of comparatively wealthy town, although it had a very large working class population and lots of people employed in textile industries, both in Leeds and in the surrounding districts, Huddersfield, etc., towards Lancashire and the Pennines. And so this is one page of the Northern Star. seeing it on this whiteboard is actually probably is as big as an actual copy was. So you have to really bear that kind of materiality in mind when we're thinking about it. It wasn't something that could be folded up easily and shoved in your pocket if you were trying to hide evidence of your seditious political movements. It was really quite clunky and really sort of quite difficult to hide. And so because of that, it was really prized and really embraced by its readers. It cost 4.5 pence per issue, which was expensive for a radical newspaper, but that meant that it was legal, and that meant that it could keep going. And it did keep going for 15 years, which made it the longest running radical publication of its period. So the Northern Star, it was based in Leeds in the Yorkshire heartlands for the first sort of 7 years of its print run, and it began to find its feet. It was owned and sort of semi-edited by leader of the Chartist movement, Fergus O'Connor, an Irish former MP and landowner, who devoted himself to working alongside radical movements and especially campaigning against the New Poor Law as well, a meeting at which was where the Northern Star was founded. And he really set this up to be what he referred to as the national organ of the Chartist movement. He ensured that it was going to be a legitimate competitor with the regional weeklies, such as the Leeds Mercury, the highest selling and most widely read newspaper in Yorkshire. But in 1 week in 1839, it actually technically outsold the Times, which made it, for that week, the most widely read newspaper in the country, which is a sort of really impressive statistic to have, and really shows not just the local or the regional, but the national reach that the Northern Star had. A big part of this was because it developed its own sense of news, and its own sense of news for the radical movement and the Chartist movement in general. So I'm talking today about the column Chartist Intelligence, and here we have several examples from the Chartist Intelligence column throughout the years. This is just a flavour of the 15 years of material that it includes. You have intelligence, importantly, was another word for news, but news focusing on a specific area in this period. So every newspaper would publish what was called parliamentary intelligence, i.e. reports of the parliamentary proceedings in the House of Commons during those weeks. But the Chartist intelligence was different. You had reports of lectures happening and how well those lectures were selling. You had intelligence of babies being born to radical parents within these communities, and especially when those babies are born things like John Frost, leader of the Newport Rising. You also had these sort of public news of tea parties and soirees, as this example from Oldham shows us, where the radicals of this town are going to have a public tea in honour of Mr. McDowell. 300 tickets have been printed. It tells you how much they cost, and it also says that if you don't have lectures for tea, you can still get tickets to Dr. McDowell's lecture by paying an additional 3p. And so this was it. In lieu of the sort of part of parliamentary news, and in lieu of working men being enabled to have their words heard throughout Parliament and have their views heard in this kind of legitimate political sphere, they are being heard in the Northern Star. They're being heard in their own national forum. Chartist intelligence is also used to organise the National Charter Association, which was one of the first political parties that is, again, sort of explicitly by working class people, predating the Independent Labour Party by at least sort of 50, 60 years. This was a political party, and it was kind of legitimised as such by its sense of bureaucracy. It had a real material culture to it. You had to register. It had national and regional secretaries, committees, treasurers who would keep hold of finances. They would have annual party conferences and conventions, and you would become a card-carrying member of this. You would have a legitimate membership card in order to compete with those parties that were being legitimised by their presence in Parliament by wealthier people. And indeed, it's under the National Chartist Association that Fergus O'Connor actually won his seat in the 1847 general election, representing the National Charter Association for Nottingham. One of the other really distinctive things that you have in the Northern Star is some sort of regional news, and we see this starting in 1839, but it's in 1840s, in the 1840s and 1841 that you really get this new column of Chartist intelligence. And the extent to which the National Charter Association is prevalent in these early days of the paper can be seen in this graph, which is I've taken a sample from the first issue of each month of the Star for across these few years, sort of roughly since its launch. And as you can see, sort of as we get through to 1841, you get these regular and sort of increasing membership sort of numbers of the National Charter Association, demonstrating a sort of a flavour of how much of this is being organised on the pages of the Northern Star. And during the trial and imprisonment of Fergus O'Connor, again, these are sort of going up in the absence of him writing about other things in the newspaper. Again, their movements are being legitimised through their own space, through their own national organ or national forum. And this allows us to see which kind of issues were important within the Chartist movement. It wasn't just the writing of the Chartist petitions and the organising for the Chartist petitions, the national executive, the national sort of party meetings and conferences, although this was a very large part of the Chartist movement. But you can really see the kind of small-scale national organising that goes on. And it's no surprise that almost every historian of the Chartist movement uses the Northern Star as a real main source of information for finding political organisation. And I think more needs to be done in terms of the scholarship and the historiography of the Chartist movement to look at how the paper was being constructed by its editors, but also by its readers, and think about it from the sort of periodical and an authorship perspective, rather than simply a space to be mined for information of the movement, or using it as a calendar or a timeline. So here we've got a few examples of some of the smaller instances of things appearing in the Chartist movement and in Chartist intelligence. In 1841, you have this example of Abel Hayward, the Manchester-based publisher and seller of the Northern Star in Manchester, exhibiting phantasmagoria in the room, that being the Chartist meeting room, in central Manchester, and the charge of administration being 1 penny devoted to the victim fund. We also see an example from Little Horton, a meeting being held where a lecture wasn't taking place. Instead, someone simply read out the Northern Star for the week, and another collection is being made on behalf of the victim fund, with telling us how much has been collected in this as well in 1842. We also have a number of subscriptions coming from Bristol from these named donors, these named contributors, with the amount that they are donating, again, to the victim fund. There were several victim funds within the Chartist movement, and these were aimed to support people who had been imprisoned for their Chartist activities, most notably the 3 leaders of the Newport Rising, including John Frost. These 3 who were transported to Australia for their actions. But you also had people like Samuel Holbury, who was imprisoned for his part of the Sheffield Rising and ended up dying due to his poor treatment and illness in Northallerton Jail. His funeral was paid for by donations to the Victim Fund, by Chartist community organisers, by people giving what change they had, and by people organising in the Northern Star, which meant that they could afford to put him in a grave in Sheffield General Cemetery, as well as supporting his wife and the 5 children that he left behind in his absence. So victim funds weren't just for the person, they were also for the families of the people who were affected, and these were often known as the widows and orphans funds. Now, not all of these widows and orphans had husbands who had died, but husbands who were imprisoned, husbands who were transported, they for all there may have been, they may as well have been dead, because in a in a sort of family household where a man's wage was going to be the most, they weren't able to economically contribute, and this was the fault of the state. They were referred to as the wig-made widows. We sort of also see this column as evidence of Fergus O'Connor and factionalism between Chartist leaders within the Chartist movement. So in the sort of origin of the Chartist intelligence column in the Northern Star, we have opposition to what was known as William Lovett and John Collins' New Move. This was a real factionalist movement between Fergus O'Connor on his sort of side, the more northern side of the Chartist movement, and the more London-based, slightly more genteel London Working Men's Association. Lovett and Collins, sort of once emerging from prison, published a pamphlet arguing for the way that the Chartist movement should focus more on what was known as knowledge Chartism, this idea of prioritising education, and it proposed a large number of sweeping social reforms. But Fergus O'Connor had issues with this because it suggested that that manhood suffrage or universal suffrage wasn't then a God-given right. It meant that people had to demonstrate their worth for it, which he saw as being incompatible with the principles of the People's Charter. And O'Connor's followers got sort of really heated into this, and you see them writing pages and pages and sort of all of these articles in support that were published in the Northern Star. Of course, this was Fergus O'Connor's paper, so if there were things that were going to be kind of inflammatory about him, they could simply choose not to publish it. And the extent to which that level of editorial control is going on, we can never know because we don't have the surviving records. We can only speculate at how tantalising it is. Just going to skip that for the room of time. The organisations that are represented in the Chartist movement don't just show the national reach of the Chartist movement, but the international reach of the Chartist movement. We are getting reports about the National Charter Association and the Chartist Land Plan from France, your neighbours in Rouen and Boulogne. And I would refer you to Fabrice Bensimon's excellent book on the Chartist movement that came out in 2022, I believe, where he talks about sort of British expats who were working in the textile factories of Rouen in the Northern District, where they were able to make money and still reading the Northern Star, and that you had sort of people buying shares in the Chartist Land Plan from this far away, eventually sort of hoping to return back home and return to live on the land and have this sort of agricultural, agrarian dream life that was sort of seen in the Chartist imaginary as being a sort of happier, healthier time. It's not just across to France that we're seeing the Chartist intelligence being represented. We also see it reaching Australia. This is referring to the transported Chartists, and in this example we have from William Ellis, a transported Chartist who was for his work in the Newport Rising. And this is a publication, this is a sort of published letter from him written to his wife. His wife and their several children are struggling to survive in Wales. They've moved to England to try to open a shop in London with the support of Chartist subscribers to the Victim Fund, but they simply cannot catch a break. And this sort of glimpse demonstrates the real personal reach of the Chartist movement, and indeed the authorities' clampdowns on what they saw were legitimate forms of protest in order to get what they believed was their democratic right as citizens, the ability to vote, the ability to stand up for themselves and petition for their rights. We see that he signs it, "Your ever-loving husband, but poor exile," with his full name. And this is really used as part of Chartist intelligence, not only so that readers can know how their sort of transported comrade is doing abroad, but to entice them to think about this in terms of their own situations. how they feel if they were separated from their families, and to really implore them to support Emma Ellis, that she has sacrificed her husband in the name of the political cause. And so although he's living, he's still a political martyr. Alongside this idea of martyrs, we also have this idea of real martyrs, and this includes obituaries of established Chartists or established activists. Here we have an example from Rochdale in 1847 of Betty Scott, a woman who was noted as one of the females cut down by the execrable band of murderers, the Peterloo Butchers, and she struggled on under the banner of democracy until the Charter was born. Her last request was that she might be carried to the grave by Chartists. And so these are sort of really examples. They're treated as though they are military veterans, people who have given their lives for these political movements. So whether that was signing their name to a petition, whether that was donating to the victim fund, or whether that was participating in armed uprisings. And again, all of this column of the Chartist movement demonstrates this idea of what it is to be a Chartist, who gets to be part of this group, a group of people who are only so because they are excluded from formal legal participation in parliamentary politics. So I've brought you to 1847. Now, as we know, the Northern Star ran until 1855, but following the failure of the 1848 petition to Parliament, partly threatened by the wave of revolutions across Europe, including here in France, a number of factors, including competition from other legal radical presses, such as Reynolds Weekly News, which was based literally down the road from the Northern Star offices in London, as they were at that point, sort of hoovering up their readership, focus in terms of the news content on internationalist movements, which were seen by the then editor as more exciting, as well as Fergus O'Connor being busy with parliamentary matters, where he was there representing the National Charter Association, but sort of being an MP in London was seen as really being quite declining to his health, and indeed he died in 1855 after resigning as an MP and being committed to an asylum in 1852. We see these sort of fractions in not just the National Charter Association, but within the Chartist movement more broadly. So Betty Scott is kind of seen as one of the last sort of unified aspects of Chartist intelligence. We see between 1850 and 1885 this idea of provisional committees in the National Charter Association. It's no longer completely firm. There's a lot of debate on how they should be organising in the wake of the failed petitions and what to dwindle. And eventually the efforts of the Chartist movement, and indeed the Northern Star, are more focused on, one, supporting people who've been imprisoned, sort of focusing on the victim fund and other other radical organisations, but especially the movement to repeal the taxes on knowledge. They saw the Northern Star throughout this period as a really important means by which Chartists all over the country could organise, could connect with each other, could get ideas, and indeed could elect people to meet throughout the country in London. And instead, they sort of focus their energies on ensuring that such radical newspapers, access to news, but also access to information for entertainment purposes as well, could be done. And there we have the end of Chartist intelligence and the Northern Star.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening.